Hello and welcome to this Bloomberg Opinion live stream on what Trump 2.0 means for Europe. It's quite a big topic, so to help me break it down a bit over the next 30 minutes, I'm joined by two Bloomberg Opinion columnists. Lionel Laurent is joining us from Paris, and Mark Champion, normally my desk neighbor from London. Good to see you both. So Europe has been claiming for a while now that it would be prepared for whatever the outcome of the US election was. The word Trump-proofing was often bandied about. But clearly this is a moment that was hard to prepare for. And I think Emmanuel Macron captures it when he called the election a decisive moment in European history. He said, we must decide if we want to write that history or have it written by others. Lionel, let me start with you, especially since you're fresh from chronicling the recent struggles to get a budget passed in France, the downfall of the Barnier government, Germany's collapsed coalition. To what extent is Europe ready to write its own history?
Well, first of all, let me just clarify, I'm not in Paris right now, as you can tell from the palm tree. But I was just a week ago in the Alps near the Swiss border, where there was a conference of top European politicians, policymakers, economists, that sort of thing. The general vibe, which is to answer your question, was definitely not Europe ready, right? It was a bit nervous, a bit despondent, and there was maybe, and this might suit the conversation later, almost a bit of a complete difference of analysis between the European guests and the American guests. The American guests, who were by no means part of the Trump administration, but they were seeing that Europe was maybe a bit too focused on the US and not enough on either fixing its own problems, but even China as a risk to Europe. So I'm just going to throw that out there as a kind of a prefacing comment. So yeah, I would say that Europe is clearly not as ready as it should be if you think that the idea is that Europe should basically be standing on its own 2 feet a bit more self-reliant. I've said that Europe is defenseless against MAGA. I would say that it's literally defenseless, and that a lot of problems flow from defense. There should have been a lot more focus on defense by now, and there will be now. It's a very consensual topic. But if you fix defense, you at least fix direct issues with this perception from the US side that Europe isn't pulling its own weight. And also you solve other issues that trickle down from that, such as trade, because defense is used as a kind of excuse to punish Europe for other trade perceptions. So I'd say that Europe needs to be not panicky, it needs to be pragmatic and take Trump at face value as well. But clearly now there needs to be a focus on what are the priorities now? What is the leverage that Europe has, if any, on issues like trade, on the economy and competitiveness and tech? What can Europe do first to kind of really get out of its slump? And then maybe in terms of actual friendships and alliances that Europe can forge outside of the kind of US-China Cold War, could that help its position too?
Yeah, I mean, I read somewhere that, someone called Biden the last Cold War president. You spoke of priorities. It's very clear that his successor's priorities are, and I think Macron has even said this in one of his, many lengthy speeches, the priorities are first the US and second China. For the first time in a very long time, it feels like Europe doesn't even figure in the Trump psyche. And I was in Washington not too long ago, and I really got that sense as well that Europe is if America thinks of it at all, it's as a nice place to go for holidays. The source of some nice luxury goods that Trump would rather see less of. But I'd like to come back to the defense issue, because I think that, as you said, that's really central. But sticking for just a moment longer on Europe's economy and this idea that Europe can withstand whatever Trump throws at it. We have had a number of reports now commissioned by Europe itself, by the European Commission, on why Europe can't grow faster. It's lagging competitiveness. So just, Lionel, if I could just give you a follow-up, and here we've got a good chart here showing that the gap between Europe and the US and per capita GDP it's been widening for decades now, but it really took off after the financial crisis. To what extent is Europe listening to the conclusions for those reports? Are you expecting any change of direction? We've got a new commission now that is not quite in place. What are you hearing and seeing on that front?
So I'm not too optimistic in the short term. I have to say that I think for all the reasons that you've explained, structural, long term, but also US related and China related, I think basically the gap between the US and Europe is going to grow, right? I mean, let's face it, for next year, I think that's a fact. And your line about Europe being a nice place to go, I mean, I'm sorry to say that again, that is going to continue being the fact next year. You'll note that the Notre Dame reopening, which Trump attended, that apparently has seen tourism bookings kind of leap, and we're sort of clinging to that because there just isn't that much growth anywhere else. That's the big difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Back during the Trump 1 era, France and Germany, Europe's core, was still performing quite well. The UK hadn't fully left. There was still a sense that the model was kind of holding. Today, I think all of them, I mean, you've heard this line a lot, Draghi said it again, all those dependencies, Russia for energy and China for exports and US for defense, they're now kind of really obviously cracking. To your point about what Europe can do and is doing, I think it's definitely good that Draghi has this report out, and it's definitely part of the Commission's 5-year plan or 5-year governance. So it's good that we have that on the shelf. That's definitely being followed. A lot of it, though, is about making the single market more unified and more coherent, more cohesive, supply side. All of that is great, and that's definitely needed. But the one missing element, I think, is demand. It's demand inside Europe. It would be great to make electric vehicles at home that are really great and perform well, but if nobody can afford them in Europe because the wages aren't high enough, because it's all geared towards exports, there's no point. So what's going to be crucial going forward is, will there be more fiscal stimulus, more joint borrowing and things like defense? Will the European Central Bank help with looser monetary policy? Will there be a genuine mindset shift to get demand going and growth back on the agenda, which again would really help Europe withstand whatever Trump throws at it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Notre Dame, would that Notre Dame were a metaphor, or its restoration were a metaphor, and as I think you've noted, for Europe as a whole, and it could somehow, just be revived. But that was done with private money, right? That was done through private donations, and here we seem to be waiting for the state to come up with the goods. Mark, can I bring you in here and ask just, first of all, what are your thoughts about the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2? We obviously have a different world in many ways, and you've been writing so much about that. What do you expect to see that is, that maybe wasn't the case in the first Trump administration, despite all the fears?
Yeah, I think, I just would second everything that Lawrence said. And then just say, economically, as he said, Europe's not doing as well. Politically, it is more fractured. The center is much weaker. Before you had Macron, Merkel, etc., and there had been a fear that there would be a wave of, populist ultra-right elections that would kind of ride on Trump's coattails, and that didn't happen. But we're in a very different position now, and you've got a very kind of weak political center and much more, rising strength on the populist right. So, there will be lots of opportunity for Trump to divide, which he enjoys. He will, one of the great things of doing things like slapping on large, general tariffs is that you can then pick and choose and favor and punish as you wish. It's one of the, the things that all, more call it centralized, leaders, authoritarian, whatever you want. That is one of the things that you do, either with taxes or with, whatever. You set these broad, very high levels, and then you can just pick and choose. So I think it's going to be very difficult for Europe to respond. Having said that, the other thing that I think is kind of interesting is that, in between, you've had COVID, you've had all these different things that have led to Europe's weakening economically and politically. At the same time, you've had the invasion of Ukraine, which in one sense has been, relatively unifying. I mean, there aren't, we're worried about the divisions now, but if you think about where we were and what people expected to happen, it was a relatively unifying event. And there is now a unified consensus that we do, all need to do more in defense, for example. And also, there's a very interesting poll out from the ECPR, European Centre for Foreign Relations, Council for Foreign Relations, this week, where they looked at, across the major countries in Europe and asked, various questions about, for example, would you like to trade access for the UK in the single market for a greater integration of the UK into European security? Questions like that, which is surprisingly high levels of yes, from countries, less so France, but still a plurality of yes, but you got to very high levels elsewhere. And within the UK, a much more, than one would expect, willingness to say, yes, we'd like to see more integration with the EU, more economic integration, more, open borders for free movement and work. All those sorts of things that were really kind of lightning rod issues, some years ago during the Brexit campaign and so on. I think that, this idea that we are now no longer in a kind of post-modern world where we don't fight wars, we may well have to, and we can't rely on the US. I think, it's interesting to see the public kind of get ahead of the leaders on those kinds of issues. I think it'd be very difficult to get there. It always is. There's a kind of myriad reasons why it's always been hard for European defense to consolidate in the ways it needs to. So much money is wasted and so on. But you really do see things beginning to change in terms of attitudes. So we'll see. I think it will be incredibly difficult. I think the tariff challenge will come, and Europe will struggle. It will be put in a very difficult place between the US and China, and it'll be tougher than last time because Trump is prepared and he has the people around him this time are true believers chosen for that reason. There will be no so-called adults in the room trying to hold him back.
Yeah, exactly. That's a point you hear made quite a lot. I mean, I guess you could argue almost that Trump 1 wasn't so terrible for Europe in certain respects. It did, he wasn't wrong to chastise Germany over its gas dependency on Russia. Europe's defense spending increase didn't begin with Trump. It began, pretty much after Russia's annexation of Crimea, but it certainly has accelerated. And, by juicing the American economy, he, gave home to many more European exports. So Trump 1 wasn't necessarily a disaster for Europe, but there are all sorts of other challenges that have now been layered on top because of Ukraine, because of Europe's lagging competitiveness. You mentioned China, and I wonder, how both of you see, Europe's positioning itself amid US-China tensions, because on the one hand, obviously China's economic rivalry with Europe is intensifying. We've seen tariffs against key industries, EVs and semiconductors. Trump is certainly going to put pressure on China, on Europe to fall into line. Where are those fault lines in your view? Happy for either of you to jump in on that.
So I would, I find it quite difficult to predict this, because Europe will be put into this very tough position, especially if Trump does go through with his, 10-20% tariffs, and makes, and really shrinks the availability of the U.S. market for European exports. Europe has to find somewhere else to send those. And at the moment, the Chinese economy is not doing very well, and you've got tensions already. But I do wonder, where another ready, expanding market that's going to come. It's all very well to say, find other ones. But if Europe can't, then I think you'll find again, some division within Europe about how to play this, and whether to try and reset with China, because and I think that it's very hard for me to predict how that will play out, but I think if Trump does play hardball on trade, and he starts a trade war with both of America's big markets at the same time, there's going to be some very, very tough decisions for European leaders to make, and I think they may well divide.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe we could also agree that hugely different from Trump 1, right? I mean, back then it was a kind of case where Europe was almost jumping into bed with China as a kind of alternative, and even thinking of signing these big investment agreements in 2020. I mean, that just seems like a planet away. The language in China's changed. I really think that if you look at the EV tariffs that Europe is contemplating on Chinese cars, I just think it's going to be really hard actually for Europe to play the China card in that way. I think actually it's going to feel and want a lot more pressure to see China as its own rival, its own export rival.
Yeah. So
yeah, very tough, because also when you just remember that the Trump tariffs last time were quite limited, steel, aluminium, and it was something that was fairly manageable. We yet to see, but the things he's talking about are much broader and much less easy to negotiate away. So I think Europe will end up in a very unenviable position, at both ends.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, it remains to be seen whether the bite is as bad as the bark this time around, or whether a lot of this preemptive, these threats are meant preemptively to try to influence behavior. And, but, look, I think all of these discussions are so influenced by what happens in Ukraine, on so many levels, from trade to immigration, which affects the political landscape, and obviously defense spending. So let's talk about where we think things are going to go in the months ahead. Mark, just coming to you again to start with, it feels like we're having talks about talks without any real knowledge of whether Putin is ready to stop the war in Ukraine. I wonder whether you think Trump can get a deal that ends the war, and what that would look like. Macron, we've seen, is reportedly trying to get a French-Polish peacekeeping force together to monetize a demilitarized zone. That just really seems to be getting out ahead of things, but maybe not. What are we?
Well, I mean, if there's one thing I would put some money on, it's that if there is a deal, then Putin would not accept French and Polish peacekeepers. So I'm not quite sure where that's going. I think as not infrequently with Macron, there's a certain amount of positioning. But I find it very difficult to imagine an outcome that has Polish peacekeepers between in eastern Ukraine, between the Russians and the Ukrainians. There will be a settlement. I mean, there's no question that there will be. The question is, when will it come? And at the moment, if you listen to everything that is said from the Kremlin, from Putin himself, from his spokesman, everything that they say basically says, look, we're winning. And Lavrov the other day was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. A very enjoyable event for Lavrov, you could tell. But it's the same thing. We're winning. We're not. We've always been open to a deal. The deal is Ukraine accepts our terms, and that deal is that we've annexed blocks of territory, some of which we conquered, some of which we haven't. So we get all that, and once Ukraine accepts that, we can talk about other stuff. So that is going to be a very difficult starting point. And we don't really yet know whether Trump has kind of internalized that he is, willing to just accept that that is where we start from. And then he puts pressure on the Ukrainians to accept, which would be very hard for the Ukrainians. They are in a really difficult position now. Or whether he has, some other ideas about trying to also hold Putin's feet to the fire. I don't know. I'm not very optimistic. But it's going to be nobody is more worried about this, believe me, than the Ukrainians.
Yeah. I mean, this also poses some pretty hard questions for Europe on several fronts. So Europe will be obviously involved somehow in any sort of security guarantees for Ukraine. EU membership is, something the Ukrainians dearly want. Arguably, that is one of the things that provides some of that security. NATO membership, okay, that maybe that gets parked for a while. What's your thoughts on, how ready is Europe to step up, whether it's security guarantees on the EU membership front, where, let's not forget agriculture is a massive blocking point. And, just generally on reconstruction and all of these things that Trump is going to very happily hand over to Europe and say, this is this war is on your territory, it's your problem.
Well, let's start with what I would like to see, what would be constructive. And I think Mark alluded a bit to this. Clearly, Europe is trying to get a seat at the table. It's really putting forward all the cards they can play to say, this is where we need a role and this is why we need a role. One of them could be this peacekeeping force. I mean, you have to be a little bit skeptical about just what kind of force could genuinely make a difference. Will it just be symbolic? Will it really have anything credible if it's not with the US? But also funding, right? So clearly, the one thing Europe has, as we all know, is a big, wealthy market. I mean, there's clearly money there. So Europe also has to step up and say, we need to be at the table because we are going to provide a lot of reconstruction funds. Let's not forget the whole story of the frozen Russian central bank and other assets. I think it was the right call to kind of just keep that frozen and not start to already use it. But again, that's a bargaining chip. So all of those are kind of ideal ways for Europe to say, we are in the game, we can take part. Where I'm really kind of pessimistic and nervous is the politics of it. For the past couple of years, I've been struck by the kind of issue of the home front and how there was always during, for example, the inflation shock. That was also part of the Ukraine story. Shoring up the home front and avoiding a breakdown of the social contract where people start to say, wait a minute, this is all because of that war over there, and if we stop that war over there, we'll have a better life. And I still see shades of that. I mean, whether it's fear over Ukrainian agriculture flooding the European market, but there's politicians having zero interest or courage in actually speaking openly to the people about, okay, how long does this war last? What are our war aims?
Yep.
How does it end? And now you see everybody, Trump isn't even president yet. And everybody's now acting, oh, great, he's not even in power yet, and everyone's falling into line. So that's my pessimism. It is the domestic politics.
Yeah, no, I share some of that. And I think we're going to see very soon whether Europe's political leaders are prepared to take a message to the public that's a bit tougher on that. The Biden administration looks inclined to tighten sanctions, particularly against exports of crude oil from Russia, which is key to funding Putin's war machine. But for those to work, they're really going to also need support on the enforcement front from Europe. That enforcement is, as we understand, it's quite fragmented. It's handled by member states. And, as you say, that there's just a lot of wishful thinking that somehow things can go back to a pre-2022 world. Mark, when you look at the whole sanctions regime, you were saying just before we went live that, it was actually Europe that proposed initially the price cap. How do you think that's working? And do you see any prospect that Europe could to sort of help tighten the screws in a way that might influence Putin's thinking here?
Well, I mean, actually, what I was saying was that, initially there was talk of, the kinds of sanctions Biden's talking about now And it was the Americans who were reluctant because of the worried about the price of gas at the pump. And that we therefore ended up with the price cap, which was kind of a compromise, and it hasn't worked very well. It's be interesting to see how the Europeans react now. There were big issues within Europe that they had to resolve about piped oil because certain countries, rely on that, and so they got exemptions and so on. But we'll see. I think we're, in the end, at the moment, what really matters is what is done with Russia's dark fleet. Which is getting this oil around. There are it is possible to crack down on that, but it's something the U.S. hasn't been willing to do until now. But we'll see. I mean, one of the interesting things is that sanctions haven't really worked the way that people would have liked them to work. They are always longer term tools. But they are starting to hurt the Russian economy, not to the extent that they're going to stop the war, but they're starting to hurt so that it matters politically. And I think actually one of the reasons why you see the Russians really escalating now, they make a lot of noise about the HIMARS, or rather the ATACMS and so on that have the Americans have now allowed the Ukrainians to use in Russia. But the escalation began before that, just the raising of the tempo of the offensives and so on. And I think that is because things are starting to bite at home. You've got 21% interest rates set by the central bank. You've got some liquidity issues. You've got inflation, double target, and these things hurt. And the economy, the government spending huge amounts on defense, which is being taken away from health and education and so on. And eventually, people will start to get upset. So I think the great issue that's going to be problematic for the Ukrainians is one of timing. They don't have as much time. Putin may be coming under pressure and he may be trying to bring it to an end too, but on his terms because he does have more time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my takeaway from that is if there's ever a time to make sure that sanctions bite, it's now. And maybe, Biden gives Trump a gift of a kind. Trump may be talking about the carrot of sanctions relief, but I'm sure he'd be quite happy for anything that puts pressure on Putin.
Gives him leverage.
Gives him leverage. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we, also is looking at what Europe can and should be doing here. We mentioned defense spending early on. We have seen Europe contributing more on the defense front as a percentage of GDP. But we still don't have all European countries meeting that 2% target. And the 2% target now looks, pitifully small. So here we see defense expenditure going up quite steadily since, as I said, the annexation of Crimea. And obviously, Trump has helped. NATO is now under Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General, who seems to have a decent relationship with Trump. I don't know if that gets overstated, but he wants to push the spending up further. He also seems to want to bring a more focus on capabilities, give European nations targets. Will that work? I mean, you've both written quite a lot about how Europe's defense industry is inadequate, is fragmented, militaries have been drawn down. There's obviously a financing part of this, but, would some kind of centralization of targeting make a difference?
Lauren, you want to take that, or shall I?
You can go for it. I can add anything to it.
Okay. So it's a really interesting one. In theory, setting capabilities targets is the sensible thing to do. So in other words, if you can field an effective combat-ready force that is well equipped and you can do it on a small budget, that is way better than the opposite. Right, massive budget, and in a way, the difficulty is I worry about how that will be formulated and therefore is enforceable. We do have a way of approximating it at the moment, and it is actually part of the target. It's not talked about a lot, but there is a 20% of your military budget target. The target is that you spend 20% on, procurement and R&D. And it's interesting if you look at, which countries, are buying equipment with their budget and which are spending, virtually all their money on personnel and pensions and things.
Yes.
So Italy, massive amount. I think it's in excess of 80% is personnel. And then you have, the US, which is around 40% on equipment. And you have some European countries like Sweden that do the same. And the Swedes, not by coincidence, are considered one of the most effective, pound per pound forces in Europe. It used to be that the UK was sort of looked at that way, but it has sort of slipped. And it's so anyway, we have a way to approximate those capability issues, and it may be that this is a way to get a kind of new head of political steam and to change things. But I think it's the right way to look at stuff. I just haven't seen how it will be done in practice in an enforceable way yet.
And Lionel, joint debt for defense, do you see it happening?
No, not anytime soon. I mean, I think that it would be a start at least to kind of pool resources without even borrowing more. And I'm kind of fed up of targets in general, to be honest. I mean, I'm reading now that France, for example, during the Cold War, when it was doing its whole nuclear program, with plenty of admonishment and tutting from the US, was spending 5% of GDP on building its nuclear program. I mean, it's what you're building. This whole target thing. Targets could be very useless very, very quickly. So I think let's just focus more on what we're spending on and getting the money for it.
Yeah.
So by the way, I should say, so I got that number for Italy wrong. It's not 80%. It's 60%, but still massive for personnel.
Okay. We are running a little bit over time. So just to, and there's so much that I wanted to cover that we didn't get to, but that's thanks to your very thorough answers and just because it's such a big topic. But, I wanted to ask you both on, we talked about personnel and budgets and all that, but what about personalities? So, we now have a Europe that we talk about it as if it's one sort of cohesive whole, but of course it isn't. There are 27 EU members. They don't share the same views. And interesting, when Giorgia Meloni went to New York for the UN annual meeting, it was Elon Musk who gave her an award and called her someone who's even more beautiful on the inside than she is on the outside. And she complimented him back and called him a precious genius, or something like that. So she's one of a number of Europeans, and Orban, Nigel Farage, who are inside, the MAGA world, as it were. And I wonder what you think their influence will be, whether you will have more MAGAification of Europe or a kind of, moderating influence that flows the other way. And, maybe you could just each give a final note on that and what you think the rise of populism. And I'm just going to flag, because we had, Mark, you wrote a piece that encompasses something we didn't get to talk about here, but why the new MAGA world has unsettled Europe from Syria to Georgia. And really all of this comes, will have a bearing on European policy. Likewise, we've seen the European core, the Franco-German core weaken, French spreads to Germany and even to Greece, looking very, very, dicey. And, Lionel, you wrote that, that France isn't Greece, circa 2015, but it also doesn't inspire confidence. So we've got, two forces, a weakening Europe, a very differently focused US, heading into what sometimes seems like a collision. Who are the personalities that are going to shape that most, and how?
Mark, shall I go first and give you the last
Yeah, please.
Word? Cool. So I think, so in terms of personalities, I think Meloni is, firstly, if we do find somebody who's a good Trump whisperer, when I say we, Europe, let's use it. Let's not get upset about it. I mean, let's be pragmatic. I think Christine Lagarde recently said, if Trump wants Europe to buy more American, let's buy American. I think she's got a point. So if Meloni somehow has a magic relationship, let's use it. She's got a better chance, I think. Orban, I don't really see it because of the whole the conflicts positions on China, for instance. I think Macron is also clearly weakened, so I just don't see him as having a major role to play. In general, I'm skeptical that MAGA is great for all populist movements in Europe because MAGA is putting America first, whatever. So if there's any MAGAification, I think it'll happen across all political spectrum. That is to say, if he turns out to be a successful politician who delivers on having the style and the content, everyone's going to imitate him, even establishment politicians in France and Germany or elsewhere. So I just don't see it as simple as saying, well, if you're either in or you're out. Maybe Nigel Farage does fit the bill, but I think that personalities matter a bit. So let's play that card. But I also just think that there is a certain gravity that's impossible to avoid when it comes to trade and economics and politics. So I think it's not going to save Europe.
True. I think one of the things I sort of make 3 points. One is that the ground is ripe in Europe in a way that it wasn't in 2016. So Le Pen is rising anyhow. The right is rising in France anyhow. Meloni is in power in Italy. You have Orban there, of course. So things are moving in that direction. And the fact that Trump is back in power and will have his own, as Lionel says, success brings following. So I do think that we will see some a kind of a wave there. But the other part of that is that if he does engage in a trade war, and if you have people like Le Pen who are much closer to power, like they're involved in government, it will get difficult for them, because there will be things that Trump is doing to their base and their political base which they can't cheer, and it will become much more complicated. And that's a kind of small way of it saying exactly what Laurent was saying, which is ultimately these are all nationalists. At the moment, they're unified by culture wars essentially, and a common liberal enemy. That's why they like Putin, etc. It's not about nationalism, it's not about your national interest. It's about your common, being on the same side of this sort of kind of broader culture war. But at a certain point, when you are in power, then these issues of nationalism they just come to the fore. And it's not enough to be a culture buddy. You've got national interests that you're going to have to protect, and that gets more sort of frictional. But I don't think we're there yet. I mean, I think there's going to be a bit of a honeymoon there for these people, and it will be really interesting to see what Meloni does, because she's been a very astute, cautious player in Europe, done it very well, and it'll just be interesting to see whether she kind of snaps back to her kind of political roots and becomes more radical, in this new environment, or whether she continues to play that kind of down the middle road.
And I'm pretty sure Italy is one of the countries that doesn't meet its 2% of GDP.
No, it's one of the biggest laggards. It spends too little money and it spends it in the wrong place.
Yeah. Thank you both for that really interesting conversation. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get to come back and have a review of what actually takes place once we see Trump inaugurated and see whether he follows through on various policies. Thanks so much, and all the best.
Thank you.